Coming up later in the podcast.
For me, it manifests as a feeling of I can't deal with the world today.
Yep.
It's this feeling that I don't even want to have my head come out from underneath the blankets. It's this very powerful feeling of not wanting to exist.
Whenever issues would arise or I'd have to deal with something, I was constantly coming closer to the point of snapping with people. If you made the fatal mistake back in the day of claiming you couldn't get up because you were paralyzed with depression, you would be lifted out of the bed with a kick. I'm fucking suicidally depressed. You're fucking depressed. We're all fucking depressed. But I remember I nearly fucking melted laughing at that because, like, that's the truth, like, you know.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Magician's Thoughts On. You're very welcome to another episode. And speaking of which, this is a very special episode indeed. It might not sound like it by looking at the title. While this episode is about depression, I dearly hope that this conversation will be far from depressing indeed. On the podcast with me today, I have a very, very good friend of mine for years and years. His name is PJ. PJ runs the YouTube channel known as Just The Tipp, a very successful channel, some amazingly funny material on there if you want a good laugh and a chuckle. And also some surprisingly poignant moments if you're interested in the subtlety of the comedy, that is. You can check out PJ's channel. As always, links will be in the description and so forth. So, PJ, you're very welcome to the podcast. We've been a while organising this. I'm delighted you're here.
Thanks, lad. Wouldn't organise a piss up in a brewery. I've been shouting on about making a podcast myself for the last 6 months, and I've done nothing. So, well, I've attempted a few things, but you would think that something like, okay, put yourself and someone else in a room and have a conversation and record the fucking thing. You'd think that'd be straightforward enough, but no, 6 months later.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds easier than it is for anybody who's listening and thinking about doing podcasting. Make no mistake, I'm no expert. I think this is like at the time this will be published, this will be like my 6th episode of this podcast. But yeah, there's a lot more difficulty involved than people perhaps realize. That's not, by the way, a recommendation that if you are listening and you're considering trying it, that you don't give it a go. But yeah, there's a lot of technical issues. I mean, PJ, you and I have been sat here now for about an hour trying to figure out how to get this started. Let's be honest with the listeners, yeah?
That's it. And the first couple of attempts at a podcast that myself and one of the lads here in the house attempted, we were just going to talk about some of the episodes of the Just The Tipp stuff we were doing, but it sounded like it was recorded on a fucking toaster, so, you know.
Recorded on a toaster.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure how that analogy actually works, but it was funny. It was funny. Yeah. So yeah, but perhaps it doesn't, and that was the point.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
But look, PJ, I'm keenly aware that my audience are interested in, magic. I'm wondering how many of my listeners will actually know who you are. I suspect quite a chunk of my podcast listeners are listeners who have joined since appearing on Sergeant Ducky's podcast. And if they heard me on there, they definitely know who you are. But just for the benefit of those listeners, PJ, who perhaps don't know who you are, what's your channel about? Do you want to give us kind of a brief synopsis of your channel, what it's about? I mean, I don't know, would you accept the label of comedian? How would you self-identify in the YouTube space, as it were?
The label thing is a funny one now. I just wouldn't know how to label myself, I suppose.
So how would you describe your channel then? If somebody was hearing about Just The Tipp for the first time, what would be the back of the DVD box description of your channel?
Well, I think I have a little blurb, and by little blurb I mean maybe it's a sentence and a half perhaps, on the channel description. And I think it reads something along the lines of, animated stories inspired by locals from my hometown in Tipperary. Only names, events, and places have been changed.
Tipperary, for those who don't know, is both a town and a county in the humble country of Ireland.
Yeah, centre of the universe, Pat.
But so I would not be uncomfortable with labeling your channel as a comedic channel, because speaking as someone who's a fan of your channel, I can say that I've spent quite a few hours in tears laughing at the various videos that you've posted. So if it's not comedy and I'm laughing as loudly as I am, perhaps I'm just mentally ill.
Yeah, well, I think, like we've been friends for years, myself, yourself, and Ducky, and we all have a similar, I suppose, kind of a dark sense of humor, or like, the whole theme of the podcast, I suppose, being about depression and stuff like that. Like, I love taking that kind of thing and making a joke out of that, because I think that's all you can fucking do, really, is you can either laugh or you can cry. So fuck it, like, we may as well have a bit of a laugh off it anyway.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant, and actually, that's a wonderful segue into today's topic, which,
yes,
dear listener, as you will have seen in the title, is depression. And as I said in the introduction, I hope that this conversation isn't itself depressing. My goal with this conversation, and I think a shared goal, because PJ and I had a conversation before we began, and I think the shared goal here is something like, and PJ, if I put words in your mouth, feel free to correct me here, but I think the shared goal is to have a conversation that offers some insight in terms of how perhaps to deal with depression, speaking as, and again, I'm sure you don't mind me mentioning this, PJ, speaking as two individuals who have suffered with depression. The goal is to talk about it openly and honestly, to talk about strategies and things like that, but also just to break down that taboo that people seem to have about mental health, that it's somehow inappropriate to talk about feeling sick in your head. And I don't know, I think that's probably that's certainly my primary goal. I think it's probably the most important thing that has to be done in relation to this topic. I think it's also important that we acknowledge, before we go any further, that neither of us, unless you've got some secret residing in your past, PJ, I think neither of us...
More than one, lad, more than one.
Neither of us are psychiatric professionals. Neither of us have any degrees in psychology, or neither of us are counselors or anything like that. I think it's also important that we acknowledge our limitations, and that if anybody does extract any advice from this conversation, that it should be taken tentatively, because I can't stand over any of the advice I'm about to give here, and I don't think it would be fair to say that PJ can either. We're just relaying
I can.
We're just relaying our personal experiences. That's really important for me to mention off the bat, because I don't want anybody listening to come to the conclusion that we are perceiving ourselves as holier than thou, or some kind of experts on the topic, because that's yeah, exactly. What this conversation is two individuals who happen to be YouTubers having a conversation about their experiences with mental health and what helped them. I think that's a fair kind of summary of what the conversation is, or kind of a synopsis. Would you agree with that, PJ?
Yeah, can't fault that description. Fair enough.
So with that in mind, PJ, and speaking of breaking down taboos, a lot of people, and potentially a lot of our listeners here today, a lot of them are probably uncomfortable about talking about their mental health. They're probably uncomfortable about admitting that they have an issue. And if you would bear with me, PJ, I just want to sketch out a comparison that I think is quite relevant here. If you were physically sick, if you had a stomach bug, or if you had a broken arm and it was holding you back and you couldn't, say, for example, attend work on a particular day because of it, you presumably, and most people listening presumably, would have absolutely no problem calling their boss and telling them, hey, listen, I won't be in today. I've got a stomach bug. Or, I won't be in today. I broke my arm. I'll probably be out for a couple of weeks or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would have absolutely no hesitation, right? But if you wake up in the morning and it's your mind that's sick, all of a sudden people become very uncomfortable about admitting it. People become there's a discomfort that emerges, and perhaps it has something to do with culture, perhaps it has something to do with how we conceptualize the mental and the physical. Because if you want to know my point of view, PJ, I don't see a bright line there. Your brain is a physical organ. And as far as I'm aware, that's where the mind is housed. I mean, I know there are dualists and people who believe in the soul who might disagree. I would ask them for their evidence if I was going to accept that. For all intents and purposes, I think you and I could both agree that the mind is housed in the brain, and the brain can get sick. So it is just another example of physical health as far as I'm concerned. So PJ, I guess what I'm asking you is, why, in your view, do people feel this way? Do you think it's cultural? Do you think it's this conception that people have that there's some kind of bright line between mental health and physical health, or is it some combination of the two? Or is there something that I haven't considered? What are your thoughts?
Well, I suppose the first two things that just floated to the top of my head there, one being it's a harder thing to verify without, I mean, like say in a hypothetical conversation with one's boss, you ring him up in the morning and you say, I can't come in today, I'm unfit for work. And they say, what's wrong with you? And you're like, I'm suicidally depressed. Like it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, I suppose, because you're exposing this weakness, I suppose. Well, what you might perceive as weakness, and you mightn't be comfortable with being that vulnerable with your boss or something like that. So it becomes something that's it's hard to verify it, isn't it? Just to kind of go, can't come in today, I'm depressed. And if that kind of became the done thing, and it was like, imagine if it was like culturally the other way entirely, the other extreme, where it was just like, that's it, just drop the word depressed and you're left alone. It's like, can't come in, depressed, good luck. So it becomes something that, like, I suppose when a prospective employer might hear this thing and be like, what? It's where how do you have that conversation? It's a difficult conversation to have with an employer, or indeed with anyone. So you become reluctant to say that that's what's wrong with you. So what might happen is you just might turn off your phone and not go to work at all, and then you might be branded like, oh, that useless bastards just stopped showing up to work one day, and nobody knows why. And the suspicion might be, Asher, he's at home playing games, or doing whatever. He's, I don't know, going back to sign up to the dole or some shit.
Or the person just lies and says, rather than admitting, because of all of the things you've pointed out, rather than admitting that they've got a mental health concern, they just say that they have a stomach bug.
I can't come in today, I have a sore Mickey. Something like that.
Mickey, for our international listeners, is a colloquialism in Ireland which refers to one's penis.
Yep.
PJ, you've put a lot on the table already. I absolutely love what you said there, and I think you're spot on. You said something there that people tend to interpret psychological ailments as a form of weakness.
Yeah.
And I see where they're coming from when they say that, and I get it, but is it any more a weakness than somebody who suffers from a stomach bug? Is it any more of a weakness than someone who has a broken arm? Just physically speaking, if I'm mentally ill, if I'm suffering from depression, yes, you could argue in a physical sense that I'm in a weakened state, but I'm also in a physically weakened state if I've got the flu.
Yeah.
And I just think that's important to acknowledge. So, I mean, I'm happy to accept that if you're depressed, that you're not going to perform optimally as an individual in society, and that could be relabeled as a form of weakness. But I just don't think that's very much different from any other illness. I mean, what if somebody suffers perpetually from back pain, for example?
Yeah.
I know people in my life who have permanent injuries, unfixable injuries. One individual who's particularly close to me suffers persistently with back pain. And sure, that means that individual doesn't function optimally. It can have a rather significant impact on their life. That could be called a form of weakness. If a battle arrives at your door in the morning, you're not going to be the best warrior, are you? With that perpetual back pain. But again, I'm just, I guess, pointing out that I don't see a bright line between that and your brain being sick. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. The thing is,
The
like,
verification.
yeah, another side of depression, which or the conversation around depression is like the whole stigma that comes with admitting that you're in fact suicidally depressed is one thing, but I happen to know some individuals, and I'd say everyone does, that are on the other end of that spectrum entirely, where they don't want to do a fucking tap ever. And whenever quizzed on, why is it you're not doing anything? Oh, sure, I'm depressed. And they're basically, after they're not depressed, they're just as useless as tits in a fish. So they don't want to fucking do nothing. So they're more than willing to kind of go, oh, you can't expect me to fucking toe the line at all because I'm fucking depressed. And the thing is, sometimes somebody can legitimately be depressed, but they can fall into that whole mentality as well. Like, I think the worst thing that can happen to you, bar suicide, as a result of depression, is when you start to feel sorry for yourself. Then you're fucked. Then you're proper screwed, because this feedback loop starts happening. And the thing about, we kind of tend to think about depressed people and all that, people that suffer from mental health, and they're kind of like, we look at them very sympathetically and whatnot. But the other side of that is depressed people are the most self-centered fuckers you will ever encounter, if I'm anything to go on, because I'll tell you, when I was in the worst of it, oh Christ almighty, like pure self-involvement, caught up in my own head, constantly thinking of, all this crap, like I was the center of the universe, completely ignoring everyone around me. Like, I mean, I've had a few relationships and they've all been complete and utter disasters, but one of the reasons for that would definitely be that self-centered nature that comes with being of a depressive disposition, if you get me. I think I've just gone off on a massive tangent, and
no, you haven't. It's all connected.
Yeah.
But you are right in saying that there's a lot on the table right now. So let's take it point for point. I think you raise a really, really interesting problem.
Yeah.
With conversations surrounding mental health and depression, and you keep talking about suicidality and depression. That is obviously an issue, but I don't think all depressed people are suicidal. Just to be clear, we have to delineate between suicidally depressed and just depressed, because depression, as I'm sure you'd agree, exists on a spectrum, if you will, or at least, again, remember, I don't have any medical expertise, but just my experience of it subjectively. I have at times been suicidally depressed, but then other times I've just been depressed. My subjective experience certainly reveals a delineation there, and I'm sure other people would agree with that. Would you agree with that?
Oh,
that
absolutely.
There's a spectrum.
Everything exists on a spectrum, I suppose, to some degree or another.
Sure, and that brings us to the verification issue, because I think that is probably one of the root causes of this taboo that surrounds depression.
Yeah,
because it's not tangible. If my arm is falling off, and I say, boss, I can't come into work. Why? My arm is falling off. The boss can look at me, or, I can send a picture, or, it can be verified to one extent or another. Oh, yeah, look, his arm is falling off.
Yeah.
If you've got a vomiting bug, you can verify by, look, I'm actually vomiting here continuously. There are actual, very obvious visual signals that this person is not well. That said, perhaps I'm cherry picking those examples. You say it's difficult to verify, and I'm not saying I disagree. It is difficult to verify whether or not somebody is actually depressed, or whether or not they're making it up. But is that not the same for a lot of other illnesses? How do I verify that someone has a migraine? Other than their verbal confirmation that they've got a migraine. Now, speaking as a person, and forgive me, this is starting to sound like the list of things I suffer with podcast, but I am a person who actually suffers quite frequently from migraines. I take my fair share of pain relief medications on the days when it's very bad. I get one bad migraine at least once a week. I don't know why I have them, and I haven't gone about trying to seek a diagnosis or anything, but perhaps it's something I will. I guess it's just manageable for now, so I'm just trucking on with it because life is busy. But, how would someone actually verify that I've got a migraine? And, I think the exact same level of scrutiny and skepticism, if not cynicism, could be applied when I call my school where I work and tell them, hey, listen, I won't be in today because I got a really bad migraine? I mean, can they really take my word for it? Is there any verifiable visual symptom? And I don't think there is, other than my verbal confirmation. And I suspect that there's a lot of illnesses that fall into that category, and yet still people want to distrust people when they say they've got depression. And, you know, there's another side to this coin that we can get to, because there are people who fake it, and we'll get there in a moment. But before we get there, do you think that that's a reasonable response? Do you think it's fair to say that there are other illnesses that are equally difficult to verify visually?
Yeah, and I suppose, look, we're talking about all of this in context of how do you tell your boss you're not coming in because you're depressed. So yeah. I suppose this is one particular context, but I suppose in the collective unconscious of society at large, I suppose there probably still is the remnants of, say, like when I was a child and a teenager, and even like a younger adult. Well, I'm old now, so whatever. But you know, the further back in time you go, the less and less conversation there was about this thing. How someone might indicate that somebody was depressed or that there was something wrong with them mentally. Back in Ireland, you have that old phrase, "Oh, sure, the nerves are at him," you know. So it's like, what's wrong with that person? It's like, well, they're suicidally depressed. But back in the day when I was a child, their nerves are at him. And this was such a kind of a fucking catch-all kind of a description that I remember thinking when I was small, and my mother would be talking to, you know, people, and they might be discussing, someone up the road or whatnot. But you know, there was an awful lot of people whose nerves were at him. You know, it's like Jesus Christ, this seems to be a big problem. This whole nerve condition, is that going? Is that contagious? There seems to be a big problem with it. But what was actually going on was there was quite a lot of people badly depressed. So I think what we still are suffering from, or what we're still seeing in interactions like that, is the remnants of a time in which the thing was neither properly understood, or that it's still considered to be a such a kind of a newfangled thing that we're not quite ready to use it as an excuse once trying to explain why we won't be where we're supposed to be at a particular time.
I think you're spot on. You're spot on. I think we're absolutely still living through the remnant of a distant past. Yes. And I guess I could summarize it in a question. I used the analogy of migraine a while ago, which I'm hoping will have shifted around people's intuitions if they were, you know, still in the mindset of, no, depression isn't valid because it can't be verified. Well, I mean, my view is that there's a lot of illnesses that can't be verified directly. You know, I think that matters. And it matters especially when we're talking about people who see this bright line between mental health and physical health, whereas I see them both just as physical health, because your mind is an emergent property of the brain. Yeah. So I guess this is the question. Do you think people would react the same to a migraine claim compared to a depression claim vis-a-vis going to work? So if I call my boss in the morning and I say I can't come in because I have a migraine, and then if we could rewind time and have the same conversation again, but in the second conversation I tell my boss I can't come in because I'm suffering from depression, do you suppose that the believability of that claim would be different given today's context? Do you think people would react differently? Do you think people would be more likely to believe the migraine claim juxtaposed the depression claim? Do you think they would be equally likely to be believed? Because I think you can see where I'm going with this. My suspicion is that because of this taboo that exists, people would be, for one reason or another, and I would argue rather erroneously, they would be less likely to believe the depression claim, even though the depression claim and the migraine claim are both basically inscrutable for the person who's being told this. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, I would imagine, and I suppose this kind of comes back to, there's still, you know, the remnants of the stigma from ages past. I would suspect that if you did actually come out with that, a great many employers would be taken aback, because it's still not the done thing. You know, I think probably people would be quicker to lie about it than they would to disclose it. So
I think you're spot on.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be my. They're the first thoughts that come to my head.
I think you're spot on. And the reason I think you're spot on is because, and here's where I'm about to get personal. Remember, one of the goals of this podcast for me, one of my goals for this particular conversation is to break down those taboos. And I think the only way to really do that is to be open and honest about ourselves.
Yeah.
So in keeping with that kind of goal of honesty and breaking those taboos, I'm going to tell you right now that just recently I called into work because I didn't feel mentally well enough to go in. Yeah. And I was honest with them. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that experience. So I'm going to be the first to admit that in the past, when I have woken up depressed, and we can talk about what that looks like, for me, it manifests as a feeling of I can't deal with the world today.
Yeah.
It's this feeling that I don't even want to have my head come out from underneath the blankets. It's this very powerful feeling of not wanting to exist. Mine frequently manifests as a suicidal feeling. And I kind of feel like in those moments that if I push myself, I'm going to break. It's a very difficult thing to kind of to verbalize, but it's a very dark place to be. And considering my job as an educator, I don't believe that it's optimal for me to attempt to teach when I feel that way, because I suspect it would be both a disservice to myself and the students. But that acknowledged, in the past, PJ, when I have felt that feeling, and I have absolutely no shame in admitting this. Remember, we're breaking down taboos here. In the past, I have called work and I've told them I have a stomach bug.
Yeah.
In the past, I have called work in various jobs and I've told them I was up all night vomiting, or I have an incredibly bad migraine and whatnot, or I've gotten food poisoning. That's another classic.
Mm-hmm.
Even though for every one of those occasions, what was actually going on was basically mental illness, right?
Yeah.
And recently, I decided, you know what, I've had enough of this. I've had enough of telling lies. I've had enough of hiding the truth, because that's actually making me feel worse. And that's a really important thing to acknowledge. And I would love to know your perspective on this, PJ. But when I lie about it, I feel more shame because I feel like there's something to be ashamed about. And that really doesn't work. And it's almost like a vicious circle. So in any case, I decided I was going to be honest, and I called. Actually, I didn't call because I didn't feel capable of speaking. Not that I couldn't speak. I didn't want to have a verbal conversation, because what I was about to admit to was already difficult enough given all the taboos we've discussed already. So I emailed the person in my school who is responsible for the dealing with absences. So this particular person would be responsible for then sorting out a teacher to teach my lessons for the day and so forth.
Yes.
So I emailed this person and I said, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically words to this effect. I said, I will not be in today.
Yeah.
I am not well. My mental state is in a very bad place and I don't feel capable. I apologize for any inconvenience that this may cause. Please find attached cover work for the lessons that I'm supposed to teach today. So I sent in cover work so that the school didn't have to do that, because I wanted to make it as easy as possible. I mean, that's school policy anyway, but I just wanted to point out that I didn't just leave them in the shit, you know.
Yep.
So I was honest, and my head of department emailed back and she said, I'm really worried about you given what you just said. And fully enough, she said, I noticed that you were off the last few days. And so she was almost inferring that she saw this coming.
Yeah.
And when I returned to work a couple of days later, we sat down, and I just wanted to say this, and I can't assure any of the listeners that this will be their experience. Maybe their boss will react differently, right? But all I can say is that my experience was actually an immensely positive one.
Yeah.
So my head of department sat down with me, and she basically said that she admired my honesty. And she said, you know, it's really good that you said that out loud, because now we can put things in place to help, you know?
Yeah.
You know, she said, come and talk to me if you're feeling this way. Tell me about if there's any, you know, particular students who are really difficult to deal with that are exacerbating the issue, and perhaps we can have them re-roomed or rescheduled, all these kinds of things, right? And it ended up being a very fruitful conversation. And at the end of that conversation, I felt much better about everything, because I had been honest for starters, and so I didn't continue to repeat this vicious circle of shame that was being kind of recapitulated by lying about it. And I discovered, to my surprise, that my boss was, when I say boss, everybody in the education system in England has what's called a line manager, and this is the person who's directly above you. My line manager is my head of department, and she was incredibly open and understanding and accepting of the problem. And it was just generally speaking a very supportive and positive experience. Now, again, I can't assure the listeners that their bosses in their respective jobs will be as open and understanding as my situation was. But even then, I suspect it's not a good idea to lie about it because of that vicious cycle of kind of self-shaming that it creates, at least in my experience. How do you react to that, PJ? Have you done the same in the past, or have you opted for telling a fib? How have you approached it? And, I guess what would you recommend to the listeners? Because what I guess, coming loud and clear from my perspective here, I'm recommending honesty. I don't think we should be going around lying about our mental health. I think that complicates the issue. I think the phrase is confounds, isn't it? It makes it worse. And what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's any catch-all answer in that. Be honest about it, or else no, you should lie about it. Never, not to say either that I could ever recommend lying about anything really. It largely depends on the manner of person that you are either working with or working for, the type of job that you're in, maybe. Although, look, it largely depends who you're working for. I've been lucky enough to have, well, good luck within bad luck. The last job that I was in, not the current job, but the job before it, my manager in that job, who is also a close friend of mine, became a close friend of mine through years of working with her, and she also had her own troubles with mental health and whatnot, as a lot of people do. But, this girl had a fair whack of crap. So she had great empathy for all issues one might experience with their mental health and whatnot. And she knew me quite well and knew history and whatnot. But this particular point in time that I was working this job, I had come off of the medication that I was on because I had been on it a few years at this stage, and I wanted to just kind of test the water to see if I could now kind of take off the stabilizers and see would I be grand without it. And for the first while I was, but then I was starting to become like really irritable and getting a shorter and shorter fuse. And whenever issues would arise or I'd have to deal with something, I was constantly coming closer to the point of snapping with people. And she spotted this straight away, and we had a conversation about it. And she knew, because like I said, we had become friends through years of working and whatnot, and we'd loads in common and blah de blah. But she knew before I said anything that the mental health was starting to decline, and that that I wasn't very far off of exploding and going crazy. So she said to me, "Look, you need to take some time out and fucking get yourself sorted. Go see the doctor. If the doctor tells you go back on the medication, go back on the fucking medication. I'll sort this out. I'll get someone in to cover your hours. I'll do all that shit." And that was brilliant to have someone like to be dealing with someone like that. But it sounds like sorry to interject. It sounds like we had a roughly similar experience. Yes.
With our respective superiors.
Yes.
And I think that's actually really positive, because perhaps maybe the taboo we're talking about, or maybe we're just really lucky, or maybe the taboo we're talking about isn't as copper fastened into the fabric of society as we think it is. Do you think we were just lucky in the superiors we had, or are we mistaken about how widespread this taboo appears to be?
Well, what we're talking about here, you see, is time sensitive. So what we can also be experiencing, I think, once we're facing the dilemma, should I be honest with what's wrong with me, or should I just lie about it and say it's something else? Once we're facing that dilemma, what's going to factor into our decision making is what happened in the past when I admitted to this. So today things are as good as they've ever been with regards to talking about mental health. So the further back you go in time, the higher the probability was that was going to go badly.
Sure.
And someone would look at you and go, what the fuck are you on about? It's like, so essentially,
get out of bed, you lazy bastard.
Yeah. That literally was
it
the
was.
prescription.
Oh, it absolutely was. Yeah,
I remember, like, say my brother, he's a good bit older than me now. I was an accident, and fucking proud of it. But I wouldn't want to be anyone's plan. Could you imagine that? Fucking bullshit. Yeah, welcome to life. It's chaos. But anyhow, my brother, I remember him saying back in the day, we were having we're having conversations surrounding all of this kind of stuff, and I remember him kind of relaying to me that if you made the fatal mistake back in the day of claiming you couldn't get up because you were paralyzed with depression, you would be lifted out of the bed with a kick.
So, forgive me for laughing, by the way, because this is actually all very dark, but my laughter pertains to a point that you made earlier in the podcast, which I absolutely love. In this crazy world we live in, we can choose to laugh or we can choose to cry.
Oh yeah.
And I, again, choose now in inverted commas, my view on free will or the lack thereof. I think you pretty much agree with me on that one. But
yeah, there can be no confusion there. We're definitely on the one page as far as that's concerned.
And ironically, we have no choice but to be.
But why don't you just pick another page to be on? Well, funny you say that.
Well, what I will say is I'll amend my statement. This is something that I got from Rationality Rules, who is a very popular philosopher and YouTuber in his own right, an extremely successful YouTube channel, amazing views. If Rationality Rules ever listens to this, big shout out to you, man. A big inspiration for me, for sure. But I got this from Rationality Rules. He uses the phrase will rather than free will. That preserves everything we know to be true and removes the baggage rooted in the word free. And so, using that conceptualization for a moment, my will is such that I laugh at dark material and ideas rather than cry.
Oh yeah, I'm the same. Like what we were talking about earlier on. Like once you were kind of asking me how to describe the channel and all that. Like on the surface level, the kind of stuff I write, it's funny country people, with a very skewed perception of the world and their little interactions and whatnot. But it's always underpinned by terrible shit happening. Like the main cast of characters in the pub, there's always someone dying, or there's always someone sick, or there's always something bad going on in the world that they have to give their 2 cents about. But it's always presenting, bad shit, like, and then laughing at it, because like there is literally just two fucking responses to it. You can cry or you can laugh. So it's up to yourself after that. And life is a zero-sum game. So I think laughter feels pleasant. So try and extract as much of that as what you can until you can't anymore, and then there you go.
I basically inferred that in my opening as well. If you recall, I said that your channel is hilarious, but for the more keen observer, there's subtlety in your humor. There's social commentary and philosophical commentary that's actually rather deep. And I'll leave it to the listeners to go and explore your channel there and dig in deep and see what I'm talking about. But if you are philosophically inclined and you watch PJ's channel, there's an immense amount of meat on that bone. And I just wanted to make that clear. But I digress, or rather we digress, PJ. You were talking about your brother and, the kick up in the hole that you get if you're suffering from depression back in the day. Yeah. And I just wanted to clarify why indeed I'm laughing when you say it as you do. I would rather laugh about these dark examples and this dark subject matter than cry. But in any case, that was a rather lengthy interjection. Was there a direction you were going with that, or was it just...
Oh, there was.
To mention?
So, yeah, with regards to, nowadays acknowledging that the conversation around mental health is as good as it's ever been, what's still going to factor into your decision making, whether you're thinking about lying or being honest with regards to what's wrong with you. It might have only been 10 years ago, and you may very well have elected to be honest, and it might have went extremely bad for you. And that decision now is like, you're obviously in a depressed state, and you're thinking to yourself, "Fuck it, will I just say I'm paralyzed with depression?" Or next thing it might just occur to you, "Oh yeah, do you remember the last time that happened? And do you remember you were made to feel like not only were you a liar, but you were a useless bastard down on top of things. And maybe like that example I gave, maybe you were met with a boot in the arse for your honesty. And now that experience will forever color your decision making with regards to, telling the truth or misrepresenting the truth in this particular example.
Isn't it an awful shame that that's the way it used to be? But I guess the good news is that that's not necessarily the way it is anymore. And while there are still people like that in the world who view depression as this kind of just essentially catch-all excuse, and not to say that people haven't used it as an excuse, but look, there's always going to be unpleasant people in the world who abuse whatever privileges there are.
Yeah.
There are people on social welfare who don't need to be on social welfare, for example.
Yeah.
That's always going to be the case. There are people who are going to abuse a privilege, and I guess we shouldn't even view it as a privilege. I don't think social welfare is a privilege. I think it's a necessity for people who are struggling in society, and I don't think it should be considered a privilege that people show sympathy when you admit that you've got a mental health concern. No different to the sympathy I would show for a person who told me they had a broken arm.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's terrible then is because unfortunately I've known a few of these characters that we spoke about earlier on that will basically use depression as a get out of jail free card for an awful lot of things, and they might even be telling the truth up to a certain degree, but basically they're exonerated from all wrongdoings because they're depressed and they can't be expected to act any differently. And what I was talking about earlier on with the worst thing that can happen, bar suicide, say, if once we're acknowledging the spectrum and whatnot, the worst thing that can happen outside of that, I think, is when you start to feel sorry for yourself and you start to think of yourself as a victim, because now everything in your head is like, sure, I can't be expected to do this. Like I've got this unique problem, and that's another thing as well that I think is kind of problematic. This whole thing of we treat depression like it's a disease that you had the misfortune of picking up, where the capacity to become depressed is not only present in everyone, but it is inevitable. Like,
you raise a great point, PJ. Seriously, that's really good. Forgive me for interjecting, but I think that's actually directly connected to the taboo surrounding discussing it.
Yeah.
People do think that they've got this special, unique problem when they're depressed because nobody else talks about it.
Yeah.
If everybody is shunned into a vow of silence pertaining to mental health, well, then when you're suffering from mental health, of course you're going to come to the conclusion that you're unique and special and that you're the only one who suffers from it. I'm a teacher and I deal with students on a daily basis. I deal with hundreds of kids per week. I deal with thousands of kids per year. And I'll tell you, mental health is a problem for those guys too. And while there are some students who will take advantage of the situation, the vast majority of people who say that they're struggling with their mental health actually are. But when they say it out loud, they say it as though it's some startling, profound revelation that they're suffering from mental health. And my general response when they say something about mental health and being depressed, I say, yeah, but so everybody suffers with it. Everybody is going to have an encounter with depression at some point in their life, and this shocks them.
Yeah. What springs to mind for me there is we're both big fans of this film, but the audience may or may not have seen it. But In Bruges, that fucking bit in it where Brendan Gleeson is on the phone to Ralph Fiennes. Brendan Gleeson has gotten the job of assassinating Colin Farrell because of something very bad that Colin Farrell did by accident.
Sure, and no spoilers here.
No, that's it.
Watch In Bruges.
Yeah, and he has failed to follow through on this, and now he's calling his employer, Ralph Fiennes, to tell him why he chose not to follow through on the thing he was meant to do. And at one point in it, he's like, he says to him, now I'm paraphrasing because it's a fucking long time since I've seen the film, but I always remember this bit because I always fell off the chair laughing. Perfect example of dark humor and choosing to laugh at the darkest aspects of existence. That's In Bruges in a nutshell.
I agree.
Yeah. So Brendan Gleeson is on the phone to Ralph Fiennes, and Ralph Fiennes is basically asking him why didn't you follow through on doing him in. And next thing he says, the boy is suicidally fucking depressed, Harry. And next thing Ralph Fiennes' character is like, he's like, fucking suicide is depressed. I'm fucking suicidally depressed. You're fucking depressed. We're all fucking depressed. But I remember I nearly fucking melted laughing at that because like that's the truth, like, you know. So he's kind of like, where are you going fucking telling me, you know, he deserves any kind of sympathy because he's fucking depressed? Who isn't fucking depressed, you know? And
oh dear,
absolutely, that's what, you know, that's I've seen people like, and you know, no disservice to the people that were, you know, disclosing this kind of thing, but I've had conversations with people in the past, and they've disclosed their dealings with depression almost like they were telling me that they murdered someone.
Yeah,
you know, this kind of way.
Yes.
Like, I murdered someone last Tuesday, John. This kind of thing. It was just this big deal to them, but it's kind of like, it's not a certain percentage of the population that, you know, uniquely suffer from depression. Everyone fucking suffers from depression to some degree or another. Some people, you know, are just paralyzed by it for certain windows of time, or else longer periods of time. I know people as well who haven't left their fucking house in years because they're just bollocks with it, you know, just can't. The brain chemistry dictates, no, nothing's happening, and that's the way it is.
I think you've raised an absolutely brilliant point, and I think it ties in wonderfully to the opening of this podcast, which is there is a taboo surrounding discussing mental health. And so we need to forgive these people for assuming when they verbalize it for the first time that we need to forgive their assumption that they've got a special illness.
Yeah.
Because again, as we both acknowledged, our past is one where this was not discussed, and our ability to discuss it is changing, thankfully, but there's probably, I'm sure we'll both agree, still a lot of change yet to come. And so there's these people who are suffering internally and have no idea that everybody else is going through either the same type of depression as they are, or in fact maybe has it much worse than they do. And so that's why I respond to my students the way I do when they don't get me wrong, I'm not a psychiatric professional, so if a student ever admits to something like this, I will always pass that information on to the psychiatric professionals in the school. I think that's my duty. But in my conversations with them, when they do talk about this kind of stuff out loud, they're always shocked to hear that, yeah, you're just one in a million.
Yeah.
You're not one in a million. You're one of the million. You're one of the millions and millions of people who are suffering with it. And again, I think the reason people have that sense that they've got this special problem is precisely because of that taboo, that people don't talk about it out loud. I mean, just think about it for a moment. If people were going around and, like when somebody arrives to a social gathering with a sling, and then everybody just talks about the fact that they have a broken arm. Oh, what happened to your arm, lad? We should be, in my view, as nonchalant with our mental health as we are in that moment with the guy with the broken arm. At a social gathering, if I take out a bottle of antidepressant pills, someone should feel no social taboo surrounding. So how long have you been on the depression pills, lad? When did your mind break, lad? It should be it should, and even I'm saying that out loud, and I'm feeling the social conditioning as a consequence of this taboo screaming at me in my mind as though what I've said is inappropriate. But I'm again choosing inverted commas. I'm trying my best to resist that social conditioning, because that is all it is. It's social conditioning, and we should be as nonchalant talking about our mental health as we do when we're talking about somebody with a broken arm, because again, I don't see that bright line.
Do you know what it is, lad?
I think mental health is physical health. It's your brain at the end of the day.
Do you know what it is?
What is it, lad?
That's preventing us from dealing with all of this.
I'm anticipating a joke here.
It's toxic masculinity, lad, is what it is.
Yeah, that's it.
That's exactly what it is.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
But do you agree? Do you see a similarity there? Do you think that should be the way it should be? Because I don't see any reasonable or rational explanation for treating the broken arm differently and being able to laugh and joke about it at a party compared to someone's mental health. Try to think outside the social conditioning that we've all been influenced by, and ask yourself and I'm saying this generally to the audience, not just to you, PJ, but ask yourself, is there a reasonable distinction to be made between the broken arm example and the, quote, broken mind example?
I think on paper, no. However, I think one has to be mindful of other factors. One of my favorite little sayings which is actually a quote from one of the Bond movies, the character of Q in it is retiring at one point in it. And as his character is signing off, and that's the last you're going to see of that portrayal of the character, that particular portrayal by that actor who's since died, he says to Bond, I'm going to give you 2 pieces of advice. And the first piece of advice that he gives to Bond is never let them see you bleed. Now, that might come off as kind of going, oh, don't ever admit that there's anything wrong with you. And that's not what I take from it. But you have to be mindful of the fact as well that when exposing any vulnerable side of you, that there might very well be bastards around who will exploit that. So you have to be mindful of, like, you need to know who you're dealing with. And if you don't know who you're dealing with, tread carefully is what I would say. And if this is within a work context or something like that, and you're not exactly sure of what way your boss will take this, I think in that space and time, then maybe elect to go to a GP about it and have the GP do that for you. And then maybe say, right, listen, I have cause to believe that, for example, the boss won't see this as being a legitimate thing and will think I'm a useless fucker and will make life harder for me as a result. Then at that point, you go to your GP and you're honest with your GP and all that. And most GPs, I would imagine, are all right. I'm sure there's some bastard ones out there, but I don't know. Thankfully, I've not dealt with one. But so they'll write up that side of things, and then you present that to the boss, and now you don't have to explain anything to them. You're certified medically unwell or unfit for work, and that's it. So you have to be mindful as well of who you're dealing with, because you can't rely on everyone being understanding and everyone being decent about it.
I think you're right, but I think that what you're describing is just another symptom of the taboo. So here's my question, and it'll clarify whether or not we actually truly agree. If in some future scenario we are totally freed from this mental health taboo, if in the future society is completely over it and mental health is viewed, as I believe, through the same lens as physical health, do you think that same kind of cautious approach that you just described, do you think that would still be necessary then?
Well, I think in principle, the approach that I was talking about is something that when you're dealing with anyone on any level, with regards to anything, you have to be mindful of, I suppose. If you have any cause to believe that you're dealing with people that have undesirable characteristics, you need to be careful what you disclose and what you reveal to those people.
Sure. But that's a more of a general point, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to hone in specifically on the mental health topic. If indeed society gets to a point or a juncture where the mental health taboo is de facto gone, if it doesn't exist anymore, do you think somebody would have to go to the lengths of getting a doctor's note in order to admit to their boss that they're unwell?
Well, you see, if that is the case, then, and we have eliminated the taboo, and in this hypothetical reality, no taboo exists, well, then I think the question kind of answers itself. Then there'd be no need.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So we do agree. Then we do agree.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to delineate there, because I don't want our listeners to leave this conversation and be under the impression that they were recommended to, be extremely cautious when approaching their mental health and admitting to it. Because my goal, and perhaps we have different goals, and that's fair enough too, my goal in this conversation is to make that kind of transition easier for someone who might be in that situation. Because I and look, what you said is spot on. I'll give you the example you're looking for. If you are a police officer who works in an armed unit,
Yeah.
Admitting that you're depressed and mentally ill could potentially mean your job. Because you can't have mentally ill and depressed people going around with firearms, right? I mean, that's fair enough. And to that extent, I agree. Obviously, you need to be careful, albeit I would strongly recommend if you are a person who's in a profession that you could get disbarred from for being mentally ill. I think if you're being a moral citizen, you should raise the concern yourself and resign from your position. I would never recommend someone who is mentally unfit to do a job that requires mental fitness to continue doing the job and to keep their mental health a secret. Do you see what I mean?
Well, yeah. If there's the well-being of other people hanging in the balance, well then no, it's not about you anymore, buddy.
Exactly. If you're a pilot and you go to work every day and you're thinking about flying the plane into a building, then please resign. Right.
Yeah.
You know, that's important to acknowledge, you know, but I do take your point in general, PJ, that there are people who are in jobs and in positions where their mental health wouldn't necessarily impact their ability to do the job, but that their boss might hold it against them anyway. And it could have an impact on, you know, potential promotional opportunities, or it might in fact get them fired. And you look, your point is well taken. You're basically making a point about utility, and that somebody needs to be practical about their admissions. So I'm just coming from a kind of a theoretical perspective and saying that, you know, we need to make it easier for people to admit that they have mental health concerns. We need to break these taboos so that we don't continue this vicious kind of cycle of self-shaming where we feel that we have to lie and tell people that we have a stomach bug when in fact we're just mentally ill. And so that's where I'm coming from. But you are, to be fair, and you're always the alpha to my omega, or the yin to my yang, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And you're just raising a very good point, really, that people do, to some extent or another, have to consider their surroundings before they admit to these things. I mean, it's like, I guess, just as by way of analogy, PJ, we would like to live in a world where homosexuals can admit to their families that they are gay. But if you're living in the Bible Belt in the United States and your family is a fundamentalist Christian family who are going to ostracize and disown you and potentially kick you out of the house and leave you homeless for admitting that you are in fact gay, obviously in a perfect world we'd like that person to be able to admit that they're gay and be able to be proud of their identity. But unfortunately, in that scenario, speaking in terms of practicality and utility, it would not be optimal to admit such a nature. And I think that is kind of where we're coming from in this depression conversation. Would that be a fair analog to describe the difference between us here?
Absolutely,
I'm talking about this perfect world where we should be able to admit that we're depressed, and you're simply raising the Bible Belt concern, which is, speaking analogously here, there are people who are living in a Bible Belt of depression taboo.
Yeah, like, I suppose another, like, one thing that comes to mind, it's not a perfect analogy at all, but I remember having an argument with this girl that I was seeing at one stage. She was incredibly reluctant to get a taxi home for whatever the fuck reason, and, you know, was like electing to just walk home, and I'd freak out at her every time. And I remember the conversation always went a kind of a way where she's like, well, I should be able to walk home just fine. I'm like, yeah, I'm not arguing with you about that. It's like, yeah, absolutely. I'm on the same page. You should be. But the concern is maybe you're not. So
maybe you're not safe, you mean?
Maybe you're not safe. Yeah. You know, like, we have to acknowledge that there are bad bastards out there, you know, and you need to
acknowledge the socio-political reality in which you live, basically.
Yeah.
The cultural norms that you're living within.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, if you're a woman living in Saudi Arabia and you decide to get a bit boisterous, and you suggest, well, I should be able to leave my house without a man present. Well, prepare to be lashed and arrested and potentially killed. You know.
Yeah, like if you had a really good friend who lived in very Catholic Africa someplace, and he was coming to the realization that he was in fact gay, it would be very irresponsible to encourage that person to come out as homosexual.
Yes,
because that person will then be lynched, and you will have advised them down the road that led to said lynching.
PJ, you've brought the conversation, I think, to a wonderful conclusion, and I think this is probably a good place to leave it. Right. Because the listeners have heard my concerns, they've heard your concerns, and they've heard our recommendations. And I think your perspective on this is so incredibly useful, because if I had recorded this podcast by myself, which is how I generally do it, they wouldn't have heard I'm consider me convinced, basically, they wouldn't have heard your essential addition to this, which is one does have to be cautious about the environment in which they live. So with the greatest of intentions, and while my goal is to break down taboos, essentially what you're saying is the listener, if they are thinking about admitting to their mental health problems and so on, they do need to exercise some caution about the environment that they're in, because the consequences for individuals, depending on where they are, could be significant.
Absolutely. Like, to kind of reference my own experience, like even say within someone's immediate family and stuff like that, like you have to question sometimes, and this is a terrible thing to even think about, because, like, you know, one would imagine that, oh yeah, sure, I should be able to talk to my family and stuff like that. But in my experience, that wasn't always an option for me. Like, my parents would not have understood what the fuck I was trying to say to them, you know, had I ever, and I never did. This is why that old Bond quote always stuck with me. That whole "never let them see you bleed" thing. That was a, you know, and not to frame my parents like evil fuckers. They just didn't get it. They were a product of their time and their upbringing, and they flat out didn't understand that, and they would have suspected that this was me trying to get out of something, or me trying to make an excuse for something, and they would have looked at it with total cynicism. And you have to be aware of that sometimes, and that's a terrible place to be if you can't rely on your family for support. But maybe, like, you know, thankfully I've always had very good friends in that regard. You know, yourself, myself and yourself have had all manner of conversations regarding this, and if you weren't there, could have been swinging, lad. And thanks be to Jesus, you were.
That means a lot, PJ, and I have to throw that back at you. And I've said this to you in private, and I don't mind saying it to you in this published platform as well. But likewise, you know, there were times in my life where I was, and you'll remember and you'll know exactly what I'm referring to, but there were times in my life when I was in very dark places in my head, and very unhealthy places psychologically. And if it weren't, and prepare for your ego to be massaged, but if it weren't for the beacon of light that you were in those dark times, I wouldn't be here having this conversation. I wouldn't be. You were definitely a great help. So
thanks, lad. It's mind-boggling to hear someone refer to me as a beacon of light. It's like, normally it's you miserable fucker. I can think of one ex-girlfriend in particular who I remember at Woodstage, during one of the massive meltdown fights at Woodstage, just kind of going like, I used to be such a happy person before I met you.
Well, on that, sorry, go for it.
I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, I was just going to say
it was good. It's nice to hear that, because at least, you know, I'm not all bad.
Well, on that note, if the listeners did enjoy the beacon of light that is PJ, the link to PJ's channel is in the description. PJ's got some incredible content that you're just going to love, and make sure and check it out. PJ, if you're willing and with your permission, I didn't get to even a tenth of what I wanted to discuss with you in this podcast, which, to be honest, I kind of anticipated, because we're not known for saying things succinctly, are we?
No.
But with your permission, I'd love to do a part 2 to this conversation, because we've barely scratched the surface. Now, if you're available today to do that, we can do that, and if you're not, we can do it another time. But whatever the case may be, I would love to do a part 2 to this conversation. But until then, can I just say from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for joining me here today.
Pleasure, lad.
The conversation was incredibly enjoyable. I hope listeners were able to get something out of it. And if you did enjoy the podcast, guys, do consider dropping a like. And, you know, if you've been enjoying the content more generally, please do consider hitting that subscribe button. And as always, again, links are in the description if you like PJ's channel, or rather, if you liked what PJ had to say, and if you liked his sense of humor, what's not to like? Check out his channel as well. But PJ, any final words before we part ways? Don't worry about a thing.
I fucking hate that song. I can't stand that song.
I might have to subtract my beacon of light compliment.
I'm about to completely undermine that statement. But that song used to always drive me mad because I used to be sitting there listening to it, and it's like, every little thing is going to be alright. It's like, yeah, tell that to the person who's riddled from their ankles to their ears in cancer. Do you know? It's like,
oh God.
It used to always just drive me mad. It's like, fucking, maybe it won't be all right. Do you know? Piss off.
On that very depressing note, on this podcast about depression, have a lovely day, everybody. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you, hopefully with PJ, in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.